Hey, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Before we begin, I just wanted to go over some housekeeping items. So first off, the event is being recorded. The recording will be posted online afterwards. You can hide captions or adjust settings with the live transcription button. Also, speaker biographies and slides are available online at urban.org. You can reference the link that is in the chat. All participants are muted. You can type your questions and comments into the Q&A box at any time. Also, please complete this survey at the end of the event, and you can engage with us using online using the hashtag #live@urban. Okay. Great. Thank you again for joining us. Welcome. We're really excited to be hosting this webinar where we can share a little bit about the Catalyst Grant and some of the fantastic work that Catalyst grantees have done in the area of traffic safety and enforcement. My name is Lily Robin, and I'm a Senior Research Associate in the Justice Policy Center at the Urban Institute. The Justice Policy Center within the Urban Institute conducts research on topics related to community safety, the criminal legal system, and the juvenile justice system, and provides technical assistance to organizations working in these spaces. Our work in the space of traffic safety and policing includes research and technical assistance about community violence, prevention and intervention programs, research on the impact of police training programs and police interventions, the implementation and impact of co-responder models and alternatives to police responses, and the impact of investment and environmental design to improve community safety and well-being. Part of the work that we do in this area includes technical assistance to local nonprofit organizations through the Catalyst Grant program. And I'm going to pass off to Marie Pryor, who is the Senior Program Manager of Innovation and Community Justice Reform Initiatives at Microsoft, to talk a little bit more about that work.
Thank you, Lily. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Microsoft Justice Reform Initiative, I'd like to welcome you all here today. The Microsoft Justice Reform Initiative works to empower communities and advance equity and fairness in the justice system. And under the leadership of Kevin Miller, the Justice Reform Initiative operates within the Technology for Fundamental Rights team at Microsoft, which tells you a little bit about how we think about this work. And as part of our overall commitment to protecting fundamental rights and advancing equity, we've been working since 2019 to provide support for data and technology to organizations that are working toward developing alternatives to incarceration, accelerating new models of public safety, and expanding access to data-driven insights. And we approach this work one of two ways: through our strategic partnerships work and also our Catalyst Grant Program model, as Lily mentioned, the second of which brings us here today. Next slide, please. And so in collaboration with the Urban Institute, we've been working for the past 3 years to support annual cohorts of local nonprofit organizations who are using data and technology to advance racial equity and justice reform in their communities. And the goals of the Catalyst Grant Program are to implement projects with data and technology to advance equity and reform, to be able to build nonprofit capacity to use data and technology, as well as to share innovations and lessons, for instance, like what we are doing here today with our two key presenters. Next slide, please. And so the map you're seeing here shows the locations of the 64 projects that we have supported to date, as well as includes the 2 locations that you'll be hearing from today in the Bay Area and also from Philadelphia, who are part of our second cohort. The link is posted in the chat if you would like to learn more about the prior projects that are shown here. Next slide, please. And then lastly, on this slide are some recently published products that the Urban Institute has developed that we're really excited about. It highlights the great work of some of the prior Catalyst grantees and coalesces shared learning and insights. And a link will also be posted in the chat so that you can access these products and learn more after today's webinar. So with that, I can't wait to hear about the great work our presenters will be sharing with you around their different approaches to highlighting disparities in traffic enforcement. And now I will turn it back over to Lily.
Thank you. My colleague Susan and I are going to talk a little bit about traffic safety and enforcement and the harms related to that before we pass to our speakers. So I'm just going to pass to Susan to introduce herself before we get started.
Thanks so much, Lily. Hi, everyone. My name is Susan Nemhard. I'm a senior research associate at the Urban Institute in the Justice Policy Center. Lily introduced some of her work earlier, and we work on similar areas, but with me focusing a bit more on experiences of harm and victimization and understanding how all of those things play into community perceptions of safety. Thank you all for coming. I'll pass back to you, Lily.
Before we get started, we wanted to start with a poll just to get a sense of where everyone is coming from. So I'll let you guys answer that poll. Thank you so much, everyone. I see that we have quite a bit of attendance from the Northeast. I guess that makes sense since the Urban Institute is in the Northeast in DC. And also from the Midwest and some people from the West, Southeast, and South. No one from Alaska, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, other territories or outside of the United States, or maybe you just didn't vote. But so the reason we wanted to start with that poll, other than that it's nice to get a sense of who we're talking to, is that you can see that there's people from all over the continental United States. And there are a lot of differences when it comes to traffic laws in different parts of the country, but traffic safety is really seems to be a national universal concern. Traffic-related deaths have been rising over the last few years, and this has led to increased police enforcement in efforts to increase driver and pedestrian safety. But policing is not the only way to increase road safety, and it has a cost. Racial disparities have been observed in the traffic enforcement of many police departments across the country, and this enforcement sometimes leads to arrests, use of force, and violence against those stopped by police. Pretextual stops, which are a stop for a minor traffic violation as a pretext for questioning and searches, are a type of traffic stop that is ripe for abuse and racial bias.
Thanks so much, Lily, for giving that great overview kind of about the harm that can come from our traditional methods of traffic enforcement and opening up the conversation on different alternatives for how we can increase safety while sort of addressing and trying to repair those harms. Something else that has come up for us or that we've found in the discourse has been this need also for more data that can help to inform change, data that's clear, that's understandable, that's accessible to the communities and the people who want to be able to access it and use it. We've learned from working with a lot of local organizations who do this work and from our own experiences that access to policing data or law enforcement data can be really difficult. While there's a lot of agencies now that have their data available online or sometimes even just for download, it's not always available and not all agencies are doing this. Sometimes the data is only available through a request or some kind of agreement, and that can be really difficult for organizations or community members who aren't familiar with these processes. But then on the other hand, even when it is available, it can be messy, incomplete, or can have other issues that make it really difficult to understand or to analyze. And that learning curve is something that can make it, again, hard for communities that want to learn more about the harms that occur, or even just want to learn more about what their agency is doing, really difficult. That being said, local organizations across the country have been taking on these challenges and working towards not only making things safer, but also making things more equitable. By using data when it is available or spearheading efforts to improve data availability or accessibility, these organizations can use their skills and research to help drive and advocate for positive change. So soon you'll be hearing from two examples, which are very prominent part of our Catalyst grant program that Lily described earlier. We'll first hear from SPUR, whose Catalyst grant project focused on advocating for legislation, and then our second grantee, Defender Association of Philadelphia, will talk about their experience after the legislation has already been passed. So without further ado, allow me to welcome Jacob Denny, who led SPUR's project on ending bias stops in San Francisco.
Thanks, Susan. Hi, everybody. Waiting for these slides to pop up. And for me to get control of them. There we go. Great. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jacob Denny. As you said, we're going to talk today about ending bias stops, how we use data to support pretext stop reform in San Francisco. So first, I want to say that this work was conducted while I was an employee of SPUR. SPUR is a San Francisco-based nonprofit research and advocacy organization focused on confronting the problems in urban policy and building cities that work for everyone. And just as a little bit of a roadmap, we're going to talk today about what pretext stops are, the high cost of pretext stops in San Francisco, the opportunity for reform that emerged in San Francisco, how we work together in coalition to support and advocate for reform, how we use data to highlight our problems, and then just a little bit about what is next in California today. So first, what are pretext stops? Pretext stops are traffic stops where a person is stopped for a minor traffic violation, equipment or non-moving violation, like an air freshener hanging from a mirror or some other non-moving minor violation. These are usually done to ask investigatory questions or conduct a search. They have nothing to do with road safety, nothing to do with public safety, but these experiences are commonly referred to as driving while black or driving while brown. Pretext stops are increasingly limited in many cities and states across the country, including Philadelphia, Virginia, and Los Angeles. So in California, what we found is that pretext stops have an extremely high cost, economically and socially. California has some of the most expensive traffic citations in the country. A single traffic stop can easily result in citations of $1,000 or more. Low-income people, Black people, and Latinx people are disproportionately stopped and cited by police. These traffic citations have the effect of stripping wealth from lower-income communities, and pretext stops are common throughout California, and they often result in these costly citations. Pretext stops also harm police-community relations, and high-profile police shootings have called attention to traffic stops as potentially dangerous interactions for drivers. With all this in mind, we found that we had an opportunity for reform in San Francisco. San Francisco has long had concerns around bias in its traffic enforcement. San Francisco collects and reports data on traffic stops and has for several years now. It exposed racial disparities in enforcement and its stops. Pretext stops are perceived to be a driver of racial disproportionality in these traffic stops. Community leaders and elected leaders began to call for an end to the practice of pretext stops. Our mayor and other elected officials became involved and supported an end to pretext stops. And our police commission began a community engagement process to develop a rule governing pretext stops and review them. So what happened next is police commission began a reform process. San Francisco has a police commission. It's a volunteer civilian body appointed by the board of supervisors and the mayor that oversees the police department. They draft policy called departmental general orders that govern how the department operates. Police commissioners sought to understand the impact of pretext stops on public safety, road safety, and on community members. And so commissioners convened a working group and began a more than year-long community engagement process to better understand pretext stops and their effects and to identify best practices. So in response to that, a coalition formed. The Coalition to End Bias Stops in San Francisco. What you see here is the logos of many of the steering committee members. The coalition formed and tried to bring everyone who had an interest in this issue to the table. There's more than 110 organizations joined as coalition members. Members included advocates, impacted people, community groups, service providers, and researchers. We had a steering committee made up of more than a dozen organizations with diverse missions and goals, including criminal legal system reform, anti-poverty, road safety, and racial justice issues. And that way we sought everyone to come to the table who had a stake in this issue, to have their voice heard and inform the policy. So the role we played at SPUR was looking at the data, conducting research and analysis to support the mission of the police commission, of the coalition, to better understand how traffic stops were impacting people in the community and how pretext stops were deployed. In California, we're in a unique position where we have a law called the Racial Identity Profiling Act, which requires law enforcement officers to record specific data about traffic stops. Officers must record demographic details, the reason for the stop, the result of the stop, location of the stop, and other important details. This data is reported to the state annually and is publicly available. So we decided to sit down and look at the evidence. Now, this campaign or this working group and year-long campaign was in 2022. So really at the tail end of lockdowns and changes in COVID policies and procedures. So more recent traffic data wasn't really relevant because of changes in driver behavior. So we looked at 2019 RIPA data to understand how traffic enforcement and driver behavior in San Francisco is working. We looked at large demographic groups housed within the data to understand why drivers were being stopped by category of stop, an individual offense, the result of the stop, and other factors. We looked at arrest rates, search rates to respond to public safety concerns, and we presented our findings to the San Francisco Police Commission. So here's just a quick glimpse at some of what we found. What we found is that Black people made up 19% of all traffic stops in 2019, despite being just 5% of the population. Latinx people made up 19% of traffic stops, despite being just 15% of the population. Asian and white drivers were underrepresented in traffic stops in San Francisco. What we found is that Black drivers are more than 5 times as likely to be stopped by police than white drivers in a per capita analysis. And we found that Black drivers are less likely than any other racial or ethnic group to be stopped for moving violations. What we see here is a purple column that indicates moving violations. Those things like speeding, running a red light, taking an illegal left turn or an illegal right turn. That's the behavior that's generally considered dangerous driver behavior that can impact other drivers or pedestrians. The gray column is equipment violations. So those are stops related to things like having a headlight out or a license plate attached incorrectly. And then the hard to see column is the non-moving violations. So those are things that be like parked in the wrong place or other non-moving violations. And what we see is that Black drivers are stopped 31% of the time for equipment violations. Compared to any other racial or ethnic group, it's more than double of white drivers, more than triple of Asian drivers. And they're stopped for moving violations less than any other racial or ethnic group. What we see is that white and Asian drivers are disproportionately stopped for behavior that's generally considered dangerous, moving violations, while Latinx and Black drivers are less likely than all drivers as a whole or white or Asian drivers. But what we found is that in these traffic stops, Black people were less likely to be ticketed than any other racial or ethnic group. We see these columns, they do not add up to 100 because there are other outcomes that can occur in a traffic stop, such as an arrest. But in driving situations where someone is either cited or not cited, which would be no ticket or released with a warning, Black people are the only racial or ethnic group in San Francisco where a majority of the time those stops did not result in a citation. Only in a minority of time did a citation occur. Latinx people similarly are less likely to be cited than any other racial or ethnic group, but Asian and white drivers are much more likely to be cited. This is slightly indicative of there are other reasons for stops occurring besides driver behavior or concerns about public safety or road safety. Despite the fact that Black drivers are less likely to be ticketed during a stop, Black drivers are ticketed at double the rate of other drivers. The sheer volume of stops that Black drivers experience in San Francisco, being such a small slice of the population, means they're more likely to receive a traffic ticket than any other racial or ethnic group. We see the Latinx people are slightly higher than white, and then the Asians are much less likely than any other racial or ethnic group to receive a ticket. So we dug in and said, okay, what's the most common reason for stop by race and ethnicity? And what we found is that for a majority of groups, the top reasons for being stopped by police is moving violations, driving in a way that we consider to be dangerous. So it's failure to stop at a stop sign, blowing through a crosswalk, failure to obey signs or signals, or speeding. But for Black drivers, the number one reason for being stopped by police is displaying license plate incorrectly. And then the number 3 reason is no registration in the vehicle. Only one of the 3 most common reasons Black drivers are stopped in San Francisco is related to a moving violation, which has something to do with road safety. While Latinx drivers similarly their number 1 reason is a local ordinance violation. Again, the local ordinance violation is things like a law passed locally that relates to where you can park or what lane you can drive in. Things like possibly parking in a fire lane. So what we found is that pretext stops are driving racial disparities in enforcement in San Francisco. Black and Latinx drivers are disproportionately stopped in San Francisco. Groups are disproportionately stopped for violations other than moving violations. Black drivers are stopped for equipment violations more than any other racial or ethnic group. Black and Latinx drivers are cited in fewer stops than white or Asian drivers. Disparities in enforcement and the low number of citations indicates that stops are happening for a reason beyond road safety, which likely informs the consideration that these are pretext stops conducted for reasons of investigation or otherwise. So we presented our findings to the commission to identify pretext stops driving disparities with little or no impact on public safety and road safety. So what we're going to do now is just a quick deep dive into the most common reason black drivers are stopped by police. We did a much longer deep dive for the police commission, looking at many of the most common stops. But license plate attached incorrectly is the most common reason black drivers are stopped. And our analysis showed that these stops have little to do with public safety and nothing to do with road safety. We'll talk a little bit more about disproportionality as well as outcomes of stops. So first of all, for stops related to license plate displayed incorrectly, again, this could be a plate missing, attached wrong, no plates, things like that. We see that black drivers make up 46% of all of these stops. Again, black people make up 5% of San Francisco's population. White residents made up 21% of these stops, despite being 40% of the population. Latinx people, 19% of all stops, despite being 15% of the population. Middle Eastern drivers also overrepresented, Pacific Islanders as well. Asian drivers dramatically underrepresented. Black drivers were the least likely to be cited for license plates displayed incorrectly. Just 22% of all of stops for license plate attached incorrectly of black drivers resulted in a citation. So 78% of these stops resulted in a warning or no citation release, compared to white people where 50 or 45% of stops resulted in a ticket, or Asians 58%. Latinx drivers similarly less likely to receive a ticket than other racial or ethnic groups. Despite this, again, because of disparities in the sheer volume of stop, black drivers are more than 16 times likely to be cited for incorrectly displayed plates than white drivers. So despite the fact that only 22% of these stops resulted in a ticket for black drivers, the sheer volume of stops makes black drivers more likely to receive a citation than any other racial or ethnic group. And what we found also is that black drivers stopped for license plates are searched more than other groups. 22% of black drivers were searched by police when they were stopped for license plate attached incorrectly, more than any other racial ethnic group. Latinx drivers similarly searched at double the rate of white drivers, and Asian drivers just searched 4% of the time. So in total, when we're talking about incorrectly displayed license plates, we found there's 4,000 total stops, more than 4,000 total stops in San Francisco. 6% of the searches conducted result in recovery of contraband. Contraband here could be drugs, could be money, paraphernalia. Less than 1% of the stops resulted in discovery of a gun, and 1% of stops resulted in an arrest. So indicating these are not stops that have a lot to do with road safety, since it's a non-moving violation. The vast majority of these stops for drivers of color didn't result in a citation, so the behavior was not worthy of the punishment as prescribed by law. They did not result in the discovery of guns or other issues of concern, and they didn't really lead to a lot of arrests, which counteracts the kind of public safety complaints. But what they did do is cost people a lot of money. So black drivers received thousands of dollars in fines and fees for this stop for a minor violation. The sheer number of stops drove up costs and exposed them to the high cost of fines and fees. And that racial disproportionality caused harm in San Francisco's black community. So what happened? What happened next was, following a year of community engagement, outreach, advocacy, education, research, the police commission voted to end the practice of pretext stops. So they passed a policy that said pretext stops are no longer allowed. In addition to that, they also voted to deprioritize 9 minor non-moving traffic offenses, including license plate attached incorrectly, instructing officers not to conduct traffic stop for those offenses. So what that means is, in addition to saying, hey, you can't conduct investigatory stops for no reason, they also said, hey, you can't conduct these minor traffic stops that don't have anything to road safety, don't have anything to do with public safety. You can still cite people if they're stopped for another reason, like speeding or other dangerous or reckless behavior that could expose the public to risk. But we're going to stop these minor violations that cost people thousands of dollars a year, that do significant economic harm, and that can harm police-community relationships. We're going to let those go. These offenses also had no relationship with any Vision Zero track traffic accidents as far back as 2014. Vision Zero, again, is an effort to reduce all pedestrian bike fatalities in cities. So these things weren't related to road safety either. And then all of these offenses had very low search discovery rates and resulted in arrests rarely, despite thousands of these stops occurring every year. So what would this proposal do? It would result in at least 10,000 fewer traffic stops. It would stop an estimated $830,000 in fines and fees annually. And it would help reduce racial disparities in traffic stop by ending the practice of many of the stops that drive racial disproportionality in San Francisco today. So where are we today? This departmental general order, this DGO, is currently under what's called meet and confer. This is a process where the San Francisco Police Union can raise concerns if the order could impact the agreement between the city and the union. It's been in meet and confer for close to 1 year now, and we're hopeful that it'll come out and go into effect soon. At the same time, in the California legislature, there's a similar piece of law legislation moving through, SB 50, which would limit the enforcement of some low-level enforcement and the practice of pretext stop in California as well. So I just want to say thank you, special thanks to the Microsoft Justice Reform Initiative and the Urban Institute for their support. This work was made possible by the Catalyst Grant Initiative. My name again is Jacob Denny, and I appreciate your time and look forward to your questions. But first, I would like to introduce from the Defenders Association of Philadelphia, Paula Sen, an assistant defender in the Police Accountability Unit, Defender Association of Philadelphia.
Thank you, Jacob. Hi, everyone. I'm Paula. As Jacob said, I'm an attorney at the Defender Association of Philadelphia. Thank you for having us, everybody, Urban, everyone who's attending. Just want to start by saying that we are so grateful to be a Catalyst Grant recipient, and we're very excited and, dare I say, proud to talk to you guys about how our little unit obtained, analyzed, and then leveraged data to begin the process of what is now the Driving Equality Ordinance in Philadelphia, which is the first legislation of its kind in any major US city. What's driving equality? It is actually 3 pieces of legislation. The first is the ordinance itself, which was signed into law, passed by City Council and signed into law in the fall of 2021. And then we backed that up with a second piece of legislation, which was an executive order signed by our mayor, which has been extremely important. It was sort of a belt and suspenders legally, in the sense that we had 2 sort of pieces of legislation with 2 different authorities that allowed us to actually circumvent lawsuits that came after the passage of this ordinance. And then the third piece is, we refer to it as a companion ordinance, and that's a robust data gathering bill that requires the police to publish more data than they already were, including race, gender, age of drivers, make and model of cars, where it was passed, where the vehicle was stopped, all that sort of thing. So it doesn't get as much attention as the ordinance, but it's an extremely important part of the legislation. So as a result of this, what the driving equality legislation does is it prevents the Philadelphia Police Department for stopping drivers for one of these 8 enumerated infractions of the Motor Vehicle Code. Title 75 is our Pennsylvania State Motor Vehicle Code. You guys can peruse that at your leisure, because I think you have access to the materials. And they have now been made into secondary offenses, meaning that if it's one of these reasons only, police cannot stop. However, if there's additional offenses, they can, but again, they need to document that and publish that data. So why did we do this? Being public defenders, we knew through our clients that there was a great deal of protectual stops happening in the city and county of Philadelphia. As a bit of background, in 2011, the city entered into a federal consent decree as a result of the settlement of a lawsuit brought by the ACLU on behalf of 8 Black and Latino men who successfully argued that they had been racially profiled by the Philadelphia Police Department. And as one of the results of that consent decree was that the Philadelphia Police Department, every time they stop a pedestrian or a vehicle, they need to fill out a form that has about 70 fields in it, and that all that data would then go to the ACLU and a few other stakeholders to analyze regularly to see what, if any, reforms were taking place. In 2015, my office entered into litigation and won the right of access to this data, which is complete but for the names of people stopped. And then in 2020, when the pandemic hit, and my colleague and I, who's the other lawyer in this unit, were not in court, we thought we would try our hand at writing a piece of legislation around vehicle stops, because what we saw was that a lot of people were paying attention to pedestrian stops because they were easier to deal with from a legal perspective, meaning it was easier to ascertain from a pedestrian stop whether or not it was a constitutionally permissible stop. However, as many people are aware, motor vehicle codes tend to be vast, voluminous statutes that are extremely comprehensive, and most people don't realize that almost anytime you're driving, you're probably violating some subsection of a motor vehicle code statute, and as a result, police almost always have probable cause to make a stop, protectional or not, and therefore it was a more difficult issue to tackle. But we had the time during the pandemic to start analyzing the data, and this graphic that you're seeing now, I think is pretty self-evident, but some of the major findings that we had was, this is a graph over time of from 2014 to the third quarter, meaning the end of September of 2019, which was the data that we had available at the time. And we intensely analyzed one 12-month period between October 2018 and September 2019. And one of the things that we saw was that while roughly 43% of Philadelphians are Black, and to be fair, we were using 2010 census data, 2020 shows that it was probably more like 38 during this period, 38% of Philadelphians, but Black drivers comprised 72% of all motor vehicle code stops. We also did some linear regression analysis, which showed that even if we controlled for things like violent crime and poverty in a police district, when the share of Black residents increased, so did motor vehicle stops. And finally, we also ascertained that Black drivers tend to be at minimum twice as likely to be stopped and searched by police, although 34% less likely to have contraband than their white counterparts. During the same 12-month period, we analyzed the top reasons, and especially the top 5 reasons for people being stopped by police. And you can see that having some sort of lighting issue with your vehicle, headlight, brake light, running lights out, comprises the vast majority of those stops, followed by stop signs, illegal tint, not using your turn signal, and registration or inspection stickers. That matters for the following reason. If you zoom in a little bit more on the disparities there, you can see that the vast majority for these top of people stopped for these top 5 reasons were in fact Black drivers. The disproportionality cannot really be explained in any other way besides either explicit or implicit bias. And the other thing that I think is really interesting about this is, actually, if I go back to this other slide, is you hear about the need to stop drivers, for police to stop drivers because of public safety. But if you can see far towards the right, this slide, offenses such as speeding and careless driving made up less than 2% of all stops during this period. And even if you incorporate driving the wrong way, police investigation, which maybe is a criminal investigation, you're still at less than 3% of all stops. So it does seem that public safety maybe is not the leading reason for this. Another narrative that you hear from police all the time, and we anticipated this pushback, so we checked it out, is that car stops are a really important tool to fight crime and to get guns off the street and drugs off the street. And anyone who's middle-aged like me and maybe their sight's going a little bit might not quite see what's happening in this slide because it's hard to see it. But if you notice the image on the left of your screen that says any contraband recovered, that blue area is stops where no contraband was recovered. That faint, almost imperceptible orange line on the top is when contraband was recovered. So at 99.33% of stops, no contraband. The blue square on the right is weapons recovered. Again, you can't really see the line. What that shows you is that only 0.17, so less than 1/4% of motor vehicle stops resulted in the recovery of a gun, and less than 1% found any other contraband of any other kind. So that kind of is pretty much chips away at, we need this to fight crime. Moreover, from an economic perspective, as well as crime and deployment perspective, we found that Philadelphia police spent 14.5 years in a 12-month period making motor vehicle stops. That's 14.5 years in personnel hours. So that's it doesn't seem like a very good return on investment there. We also continually heard that these stops were necessary to combat gun violence, but again, analyzing gun violence within this 12-month period, we actually saw that as motor vehicle stops increased and searches during motor vehicle stops increased, gun homicides also increased and arrests went down. So that was also database counter to the narrative that we need motor vehicle stops to combat gun violence. Similarly to some of the things that Jacob talked to, this is a slide from Vision Zero regarding Philadelphia's high injury network, which is roughly 12% of Philadelphia streets account for around 80% of all serious or fatal crashes. We looked at this because we realized that the deployment isn't concentrated there, and it probably should be if we're talking about public safety and motor vehicle code enforcement. So my colleagues and I sat down, we wrote an original bill that is not the bill that became law, that was much, much broader and prevented more stops, including stops for tint. And through the policy director at my office, we were introduced to a very amazing young, vibrant council member on city council named Isaiah Thomas. And Isaiah introduced this bill to council and then ended up collaborating with my office, the city government, and the Philadelphia Police Department to eventually write and pass the bill that is now the law. Unsurprisingly, we got a great deal of pushback, even with the more abbreviated law that is now the law, from the city. And we had to engage in a lot of conversations with the city law department and the PPD, the Philadelphia Police Department. This is why it's handy to have a lawyer on your team if you're trying to pass this kind of legislation. And we were able to prove to them that this driving equality ordinance doesn't conflict or is not preempted by state law, because we are not saying that police may not enforce motor vehicle code violations. We're saying they simply have to change their method of enforcement. We also we looked very closely at the motor vehicle code itself and found support within there for what we're doing, because the subsection of the motor vehicle code that's on the page there actually requires local governments seeking to enforce its police powers to do so by local ordinance. We also looked at a number of other places for support, including our home rule charter and the Pennsylvania Constitution. As far as getting data to support these kinds of bills and change in your community, as I mentioned earlier, we got that data that is required by the federal consent decree in the Bailey versus City of Philadelphia lawsuit. We relied on that to do our analysis, as ways we're very intimately familiar with police directives. Our local police department publishes those, but if not, you can subpoena them, right to know them, Freedom of Information Act, that sort of thing. We do also have some open data that's available. It's not super user friendly, but it is available. The companion data ordinance is also very important. And what that second piece of legislation did, as I mentioned earlier, was require the police to give us even more information so that we can look at patterns and trends with motor vehicle code stops. And so that, again, covers things like race, gender, all that sort of stuff. And that's important because, you know, we want to be able to be transparent. We want to be able to track patterns and have a clearer understanding of what's happening on the road. And this kind of data, we hope, will be useful to other people that are trying to do similar legislation. In the first 8 months, and I would just like to note in that picture, that is Mr. Isaiah Thomas, the council member who introduced legislation in the blue suit, and our wonderful chief defender, Keisha Hudson, speaking at the 1-year anniversary of driving equality. We saw that driving equality impacted stops dropped by over 50%, that we decreased interactions with citizens and police by 15,984. That was nearly 12,000 fewer Black drivers stopped. Stops generally went down by about 11%. However, stops not impacted by driving equality went up about 19%. On the flip side, we are still struggling with racial disparities, which is not great, but we are working on it. And finally, the money that we got from Catalyst is going into a data dashboard that we will hopefully be publishing in March of this year. For the 2nd anniversary of driving equality. And that's going to be a beautiful, interactive, easy to use dashboard that will allow people to look at stops in a really granular way in the city and in their neighborhoods. So thank you very much. This is my contact information, as well as information for the Defender Association's Police Accountability Unit. If anybody's interested, thank you for having me speak. And I think it's turning it back to Lily.
Okay. Thank you both so much for sharing and also for the great work that you've done that has resulted in some very important changes, real life changes. So I'm going to invite all of the speakers to actually turn their cameras and audio back on if they would like, and bring us into the Q&A portion of the session. So just for everyone, so you're aware, there's a Q&A box that you can enter your questions into. Also, our speakers are able to answer questions. I'll read questions out, but they're also able to type answers in. So there are some answers already included, and you can go view those. Okay, so I am gonna get us started in our Q&A. I start with, I think the first question that came in is maybe a good one to start with, probably generate a lot of discussion, and can go to really anyone of us speakers. And then I have a lot of very specific and detailed questions about each of the projects. I want to give Jacob and Paul an opportunity to answer any of those via text before I read them out if they want, though. So the first question, oh, sorry, Kathy, did I cut you off? No, okay. I heard a noise, but okay. So the first question in the chat is, what are the presenters' thoughts about efforts to push more cities and counties to remove traffic enforcement powers from law enforcement agencies and transfer that work to other local government agencies that would cite or follow up with non-complaint drivers in a manner more analogous to code enforcement agencies?
I think that's the dream. We would really like to see all armed police personnel taken out of motor vehicle code stops. However, these are extremely contentious things to do. You know, city governments and police do not want to remove themselves from this arena. We are hoping that as we continue to gather data going forward with jurisdictions like ours that have managed to start doing some of these small steps towards actually trying to reduce racial disparities, that supporting data will help us push for more of those sorts of objectives.
And I'll just add, I think it's good policy. There are legal and political barriers to enforcing it in California. Right now, traffic enforcement is understood to have to be done by police in California. And so there are conversations in the legislature ongoing about allowing cities to pilot their own programs. There are cities here who are very interested in doing it. City of Berkeley, very famously, has begun to deploy non-police officers to conduct some traffic enforcement, but concerns about legality have been raised. So I think we're continuing to explore the option. From a policy perspective, it is a no-brainer.
Thank you both for sharing. The next question is specifically for Paula. Did Pennsylvania apply for and get federal dollars from the bipartisan infrastructure legislation? Many states will pass these racial profiling laws to secure the federal dollars.
So I'm not quite clear on that. Driving equality was passed in the city of Philadelphia. It only affects the city of Philadelphia. It only affects the Philadelphia Police Department. There is no federal funding attached to this local ordinance. Pennsylvania has a Republican-controlled legislature that hates this ordinance, that has tried to pass numerous state laws to essentially say it's illegal. So we've not gotten a lot of help from anyone around, but it's again, it's survived some legal challenges. So we feel like we're in a fairly safe position.
Thank you. The next question is for Jacob. During the study, do you know if the police department was enforcing a National Highway Traffic Safety Administration grant selective traffic enforcement program, for example, click it or ticket or DWI enforcement?
I don't know. I do not know what grants the department was receiving. And I think that information is probably pretty easy to be found. I know that there have been a lot of concerns about traffic enforcement in San Francisco over the past few years, including like a decline in enforcement and changes in the department priorities that may also have informed things like federal grants and things like that. So I'm just not sure. But I know that the department behavior has been unpredictable as it relates to traffic enforcement in San Francisco.
Thank you. Okay, and then a question for both of you. If each of you could take a moment to talk about what happens after the ordinance or policy is adopted. I can add more context to that. But...
Well, I can just say in San Francisco, once the departmental general order is adopted, it just becomes policy. And so we will be able to see then, especially with the data quality we have, if there were changes in traffic enforcement behavior, if pretext stops, as we understand them, declined, or if the departments had kind of just changed tactics and different kind of stops rose while maintaining the same number and share. So hopefully the DGO will go into effect this year, and then we'll be able to start seeing how it has impacted enforcement and officer behavior.
So I can say with Philadelphia, we are approaching the 2-year anniversary of driving equality being the law here. One of the last slides I presented, which again are available to you on Urban's website. I think the link's up in the chat. So we were able to analyze about 8 months of data during the first year. And we did see, like I said, a more than 50% decrease in stops surrounding the driving equality impacted motor vehicle code violations. But as I said, we were still seeing massive racial disparities. Stops, I think, across the country have gone down. Most policing is pretty homogenous. And so while the numbers might be slightly different, you could see from Jacob's presentation and my presentation that the results of things, even the reason for the stop were very, very similar. And so I do think that motor vehicle code stops have sort of gone down nationally, but we still are seeing massive disparities. We are still waiting on the city to give us some data, and we're sort of data analysts now, but hopefully in the early part of this year, we'll have a better understanding of what the numbers are saying.
Thank you. And a follow-up to that question, just that in San Francisco, it seems like there's a, so just reading off of the question, the second part of the question in the Q&A, it says in San Francisco, there seemed to be kind of a limbo, and in Philadelphia, disparities haven't decreased as much as hoped. What can we do to ensure that these policies are implemented and followed through on?
So in San Francisco, there has been continued the coalition, which I am no longer a part of, but I will say that they are continuing to engage. There have been increased public pressure to implement the DGO as well as coverage of this, and concerns have been raised that the length of time this has been a meet and confer is possibly a delaying tactic by the union in order to stop implementation of the policy. On the other hand, it has also often taken more than a year to implement a DGO that dramatically changes police behavior and what officers are allowed or not allowed to do. So this is kind of par for the course of something complicated in San Francisco, and it's just a reflection of the agreement that the city has made with the police officers union.
I think we believe that this is, one very small step towards trying to address disparities in policing. It has made an impact. It's not perfect. And it's going to take time. We're hoping again that as time goes by and we can gather more robust data, we can add to this bill, we can expand it. And also it's just such an important conversation to have. People don't realize how massive these disparities are and how they are unexplained by anything other than actual bias. And so I think the more we have these conversations, the more people become aware. We see more jurisdictions adopting similar ordinances and trying to address this. And so I think we're moving in the right direction, as slow as it might be.
Thank you. And a sort of related question. It says for Paula, though I feel like both of you, Jacob, if you want to answer after, if it feels relevant, feel free. Now that you've seen the data after the ordinance was implemented, what changes would you make to the ordinance language to try to address the spike in stops and remaining racial disparities?
Gosh, there are so many things that I would have liked to have done. One of the ways the bill was written was a single light out. And I probably would have added more robust language about lights and time of day, those sorts of things. If I had my druthers, that original bill, again, that you can see in the slides, that's available at Philadelphia City Council's website, I believe. That was the bill that I really wanted to have passed, and that was the one that my colleague and I wrote together, and that would have essentially removed police from, prevented police from stopping cars for anything that wasn't a quite clear and imminent danger when operating a motor vehicle. We didn't think we were going to get traction with that, which is why the bill is the way it is. But I certainly would have added quite a bit of stuff. I think that original bill is the best representation of what I would have liked to have seen happen. Because again, the first question that was asked about, removing police from these interactions, we think is incredibly important, and we don't think it's necessary to have armed people stop somebody because their light is out. That those interactions far too often lead to terrible harms. And, we don't want to diminish the fear as a harm, right? Even if nothing bad happens, there is so much understandable fear that comes along with being detained by police. And we also frequently see, because we have body-worn camera, the indignity with which people are treated in traffic stops. It's not right. So I would have added a lot more language. That's a whole nother conversation, but I would encourage anyone that has the moment to check out the original bill.
I'll just say that in San Francisco, and I think as Paula just said, in Philadelphia and everywhere, this is a political process. Even though the police commission in San Francisco is not intended to be a political body, it's a civilian oversight body. It is politicized, and this process was heavily politicized, and faced political backlash at a time when kind of criminal legal reform work in California has largely come under attack from certain forces. So this bill is not, or this DGO is not as good as I think the original one was. It is going to have a smaller effect than the originally authored one was, which probably would have had a smaller effect than would have been ideal anyway. And so I think for anyone considering engaging in a process like this, understanding that, you know, what the data says and what the politics say are often different things. And we have to use the evidence that you best have to advocate for the policies that can best impact the changes you want to see. But the reality is that no matter how much evidence you put forward, there's going to be political concerns that will impact what happens.
Thank you. Seems like there's a bit of robust conversation in the Q&A on a question about alternatives. Actually, it's sort of a two-part question. So I'll start with, did you face rebuttals about removing a stream of income from municipalities by decreasing tickets? And if so, how did you respond? And Jacob, I think you already answered a question similar to that in the, so people can find that answer in the answer section of the Q&A. And Paul, I don't know if you wanted to respond to that part.
Sure. So we looked at that. Philadelphia, unlike, municipalities that have really relied on ticketing as a source of income, doesn't really rely on ticketing for a source of income. I have those numbers somewhere, but I just don't have them at hand as regards ticketing. Ticketing rates were really low. And, we do see them as being relatively low for Black drivers, which again, I think lends credence to the idea that we have a lot of protectional stops fishing for, potential criminal evidence as the real reason for the stop, not a public safety concern. I really don't think that I know that we haven't removed any kind of real, substantial stream of revenue from the municipality to begin with. And again, it's of those 8 violations that are contained in our law, there's only one of them was the main reason for one of the top 5 reasons for stopping, and that was a lights issue. And again, it's if you have one bulb out. So if you have your headlights off completely at night, you're going to get pulled over, and that's completely legal. And some of the other stops that were statutes that are part of the driving equality bill were suggested by police, such as a hanging bumper, which in 2023, I think they made, or 2022, I think there was something like less than a dozen stops for that reason, which is why they suggested it, because it's not a reason they stop people normally. So we don't think that, at least in our municipality, it's made any kind of it's decreased the revenue stream.
And I'll just add, I said this in the chat, but I'll just say aloud too. In California, we have the most expensive traffic citations in America. But many of those fees that have dramatically increased our traffic tickets, for example, if you go 5 miles over the speed limit, it's a $263 ticket. $200 of that ticket are fees that have been added over time. And those fees fund a huge array of different programs and policies and government entities across California. So the revenue concerns for the city largely aren't there. Most municipalities can't even tell you how much money they actually end up getting from traffic citations in California. But there are fiscal implications across the state. And in the state legislature, there's been a lot of work around reducing fines and fees and backfilling that money. And so I think the reckoning that people are describing in municipalities is a reckoning that's happening in states and legislatures across America, which is the fact that we've come to view fines and fees, particularly fees, as revenue streams in place of taxes. And that has disproportionate impacts on low-income communities and communities of color. And in order to change that, we have to end the practice of collecting those fees and then find other ways to generate revenue. And in California, that's come from backfill in state legislature budgets. But I know in many places that's not really an option. And my work in Alabama and Mississippi, that was not really an option. So know that this is a problem everywhere. It just looks different depending on place.
Thank you both so much. I'm noting that we are actually at time, so I'll just end with in the vein of what Paul and Jacob talked about, there are actually some catalyst grantees that are explicitly working on projects related to transparency and understanding public safety budgets, because if you've ever tried to understand one, they're super confusing. So related to fines and fees, if you are interested in that, you can keep your eye out for that. And also there's some research around what Jacob was talking about, the disparities and the disparate racial impact of fines and fees, which is we can try and include in our responses to also my last note that we did very much so not get to everyone's questions. There were a lot of questions and a lot of great discussion. So we can follow up. Oh, and Kathy's beating me to my last point, which is Kathy just put in the chat that if you're interested in Catalyst updates or our future RFPs and publications, you can sign up for this interest list where you can see what future Catalyst grantees are doing in our publications, and or if you're interested in applying as a grantee. And please take a minute to fill out that survey. The link was just dropped into the chat. It helps us to understand what works for these events and what you'd like to see. So thank you very much, Paula and Jacob, for sharing, and thank you everyone for joining us.